Wondering what the F has happened to your body and your life? You're in the right place, my friend. Welcome to Season 3 of Transforming 45, where we dive into the incredible stories of how brilliant humans are navigating the midlife squeeze with courage, passion, and a healthy dose of humor. Don't miss out on any of our heart-led episodes. Hit the subscribe button, leave a 5-star review, and if you're inspired, share an episode you love with a friend. It means more to me than I can express that you're choosing to spend time here and sharing our message of midlife revolution. So let's get into it. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Transforming 45. This week, I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite a while. I am so excited to welcome Beverley Powell. She is a dynamic leadership consultant, speaker, and advocate with a wealth of experience transforming organizations and empowering individuals. She combines her expertise as a licensed menopause champion, values-led coach, and DEI specialist to deliver impactful strategies and coaching which foster inclusive and psychologically safe workspaces. In 2014, Beverley was recognized by the Health Services Journal for her pioneering work in the DEI space, which focused on the transgender patient accessing primary and secondary care. Beverley, these are not easy times that we are living in, and I am so glad that you are here to have this conversation. Welcome to the show.
Delighted to be here. So exciting. When from our first initial connection, I've been so excited to be online with you and have this conversation. So thank you very much for the invitation.
Well, like I said, I am glad you're here. It's always nice to have a conversation with a colleague.
Yes,
Yes,
indeed.
All right. So Beverley, tell us, who are you and how did life introduce you to this version?
Gosh, well, I would say first and foremost, I am a Black woman, a Black British woman of Caribbean heritage, that is Jamaican heritage, and I live in the north of England. And I would say that's who am I now? I'm currently in the season of rest, and this has brought me to where I am today with the introduction of that you shared of me. So years of working and serving others, so in a service of education, facilitation, and a whole host of things and research, coaching. It's brought me to today where I have had time to journal and reflect and think, what is it that I'd like to do in this season for me? So this is a time for me. This is a time for me to have boundaries around self-care and be really focused on that, where historically I've allowed others or systems to trample over my boundaries, and I'm quite focused this time around self-care. As Audre Lorde talks about radical self-care, this is a season where I'm taking radical self-care.
That is really powerful, and we will definitely get more into that. And it's one of the things that I say is the gifts of menopause and this time of life is that we do start to shed all of those internalized expectations that have been coming at us for decades, and for generations. But it seems that we get to this point, and part of it we know actually is a chemical shift that is happening in our bodies that also is changing the way our brains process what our role in the world is and what the expectations are. And it's not just that. It's our lived context and what we are what we have experienced and how that has impacted who we are now and how we are making choices to move forward. So thank you so much for speaking that so powerfully and so beautifully, because it is a time of rest out of necessity in many ways, and also out of new perspective.
Yeah, sure. And that always also takes me on to what really strengthened this season for me. For a number of years, I've been reading and understanding the works by Bruce Lipton and Greg Braden. And there's something about reframing. So I was programmed at a very young age. So we know in education you are programmed from 0 to 7, 7 to 14 and otherwise. So I was operating within a systems program or family program. And now I've unpicked that learning. Now it is that time or my time to say, well, actually, this is my program and my body and brain is operating within this program and not the confines and the expectations of society or family or cultural heritage. This is me. And it's quite freeing. It feels quite freeing. So whilst it's been important to understand the frameworks by the likes of the two guys I've mentioned, Bruce Lipton, Greg Braden, et al., it's important to say, where am I in this? Where do I sit in this? And then going through this transition of my own life, physically, mentally, emotionally, through the menopause, which has woke me up. How am I going to shape and shift and still make a difference in the world? Whilst I was making a difference, it was in the confines and the constructs. But how am I going to do it differently with the new me in this season? And being on this podcast is one of those new me's of engaging with others. So this is quite pivotal, and back to why I'm so excited. This is part of my season and part of where I want to be.
Well, I am so glad that this can be a container for you to share your experience and your wisdom. It was part of my intention of creating this show, was to make space for people to come in and have these experiences. And as you were talking about, where am I in the frameworks? I thought that is a really important space for us to sit in and think about, because we're inundated by frameworks and we're inundated by expectations and stereotypes and past ways that people have moved through things. And there is very little that is written about the experience of the menopausal woman and where they fit into anything.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You're quite right there, Lisa. And whilst I think about that, and there's not much space, or it's just making inroads into this. Actually, on the way home today, on the radio in the car, I was hearing a conversation and some frustrations by some high-profile males who were not enamoured with the, as they said, the removal of patriarchy within the system, because now it would appear it seems to be quite maternalised and all about women and the menopause and things. So it's interesting to get those perspectives. And I always do like to hear different perspectives. There's a danger at this stage where we can get into our own echo chamber. And it's important that we hear and come out of the echo chamber and really get under the skin with different people and listen and hear those perspectives, because it's, I'm a big fan of one world. And as a child, I used to hear about third world, particularly from my heritage. Back in the day, it was the Biafrans in Africa and other parts of the world. And as a child, I used to think, but it's one world. But I keep hearing about a third world, and is there a second world? And I used to question these things, but within this programming and framework, I would never dare ask. But in my mind, I was thinking about this. So it's important to hear the perspectives of others who are unlike me and try to share that. But equally, there's something really important around, and I think you touched on this, Lisa, when we talk about difference, there's a danger that often we can put people in silo. So as I introduce myself as a Black woman, I don't have a disability. I'm a heterosexual cisgendered woman. However, the work by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw invites us to take an intersectional lens to life and look at oppression and discrimination in different ways. And the menopause and my own transition has led me to study my journey from the lens of a Black woman, and why there have been some differences compared to my colleagues who are non-Black, who have different experiences. So whilst we know there are lots and lots of different areas and experiences during the menopause, there are particular challenges facing the woman of colour. And with the menopause, it tends to last longer. Hot flashes, research tells us it lasts longer. And on top of some of the layers of oppression historically, there are dangers around health and well-being, certain aspects of that. I don't speak as a clinician, but I speak as somebody with a lived experience who's gone through transition, who studied it as a licensed menopause champion, and who also coaches and facilitates with groups of women of colour and get it and understand it. So that's my sort of position when I talk about health and well-being from this particular season of life.
Thank you for opening up this conversation, because the menopause conversation, I can say a lot of space is held by people who look like me, right? So white women, and that's the way it tends to be, right? We take up more space. Our voices tend to be heard more for lots of reasons, right? Like oppression has put all of those structures in place so that white women are heard more and first often. And my experience is so different. So I also, white woman, middle class, cisgendered, walking through the world with a great deal of privilege. So I am very aware that my experience is different from anyone else's experience, and that holding that privilege also is a responsibility to not just look through my own experience and through my own lens and know that it's not the same for everyone. So I'd love if we could you mentioned some of the physical experiences that are a little bit different. And I'd like to get into that a little bit more, because I think that there's not enough information that is being presented, that menopause manifests itself differently in different ethnic backgrounds and in women of color. So can you talk a little bit more about some of the symptoms? And then I want to talk about the life context as well.
Sure. So some of those symptoms can be exacerbated because of the experiences of the woman of colour. So experiences of direct discrimination or bias, we call it microaggression, although I'm really uncomfortable with the word microaggression, because an aggression is an aggression. We can't label it as micro. However, purpose of this, I'm going to say microaggression. So these things can be experienced quite often, and more so by our more so than our white colleagues, white women colleagues. So these aspects can manifest mentally and physically and can be held in the body. Then the menopause comes along, and then we have a reduction in hormones. And so we have that, and it's stripped away. And often that can lead to a loss of confidence, which I certainly experience. And you haven't got the input of those certain hormones pumping around, helping you, the testosterone or the estrogen. So sleepless nights is common. But when you already have underlying challenges around anxiety, discrimination, the lack of sense of belonging, the lack of psychological safety within the workplace or the space that you're in, all these things can manifest itself. And therefore, the evidence research would suggest that hot flashes tend to last longer with women of colour. Now, this is to say it is for everybody, but the vast majority in the research that I have undertaken tells us that. So that's one of the symptoms that we can, I should be postmenopausal and I still experience hot flashes. So this season, there is a time to step back, come off the pedal, reflect, and journaling as a practical tip, journaling, meditation, those type of things. So hot flashes is one. Certainly an investigation into the food that we eat, which can exacerbate some of those matters. So no longer, in my own experience, can I eat the foods I used to eat, because my body can no longer handle it, digest it, and cope with that. So one of the things is for we Black women particularly, to review the food that we ate traditionally, and during this phase of our life to consider otherwise. This can also lead to a rising, and I know lots of white women will experience this, but a rising blood pressure. And watching blood pressure is absolutely key. So again, historically, dealing with things pre-menopause, we might have been able to manage it, but it's further exacerbated when we have a reduction in hormones and the blood pressure goes up. We're eating the wrong food. We're not sleeping well at night. We need a minimum of 7 hours sleep. So it's a whole root and branch review of how we manage ourselves in this particular season.
And it's why it's so important that we position symptoms as messages from the body, right? Because we know that hot flushes are actually vasomotor events, which indicate, and the risk for cardiovascular disease is also higher for women of color. And that vasomotor hot flush connection is part of it. So going back to what you were saying earlier about this being a season of rest, we can no longer just ignore our bodies and continue to push through and just say, oh, it's just a hot flush. Yes, it's uncomfortable in the moment, but I'm just going to keep pushing through and pretending like I can just do anything, because that is only going to continue to increase our risk factors.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And sadly for me, certainly over the last 2 or 3 years, several of my Black women professional colleagues have just lost their life. It was said unexplained, but now going through this phase of life at that early age in their 50s, I would like to suggest, as you just said, around blood pressure, stress, striving against all the odds to prove to who? To prove to the system that, Black women good enough, but at the point of what? The body. So I had a colleague, a nurse who passed away suddenly, a chief executive, Black woman colleague. She passed away in the airport. I mean, I cannot speculate, but I am only assuming what I know as a licensed menopause champion and the hot flashes, coupled with some of the challenges that we face, that perhaps it could be a contributory factor. But it's more, there's a sense of urgency now in terms of getting radical, not just walking around the block anymore. It's really getting radical, getting clear, having boundaries and sticking to those boundaries. And yes, it might make us unpopular, but you know what? We've got one body, so we've got to take care of it. So being unpopular, if that means making me healthy, I'll live with that.
Yeah, yes. And it is so much easier said than done when we are, for our whole lives, have been trained to be nice, right?
Yes.
Have been trained that likability was our greatest asset, and unwinding ourselves from that it can be a really challenging thing to do, because it asks us to look very differently at ourselves and put ourselves at the center and recognize our own value and worth, when we have spent all of this time taking that perspective and looking outward and looking at everybody else's value and worth and supporting and enhancing everyone else's value and worth. And so it's a complete recentering. Is there one or two either moments or tools or strategies that you found really helpful in making that shift for yourself?
Yeah. For me personally, I'm not a big fan of New Year's resolutions, but I have a journal. So I've had to get really clear with myself and just journal. Also meditation. I've learned this from, I think she's a psychotherapist called Tara Hewitt. She's a British woman. And she said there is something about looking in the mirror and telling yourself that you are capable, able, all those things, but opening your eyes and looking at you in the mirror, then journaling. So I use twofold, the journaling, but also that. And what she was saying was that the body hears it. You hear it, but the body hears it. Journaling only acts as part of that, but actually saying it, hearing it, and seeing it has worked to set the balance. Also, I've been quite intentional in lunch breaks to get out into the fresh air. And what that does, it shifts my focus away from the laptop, away from studying lesson plans or whatever, to look at the trees, to look at the birds, or I'll feed the birds in my back garden or water my plants or something, but it shifts the focus and it shifts part of my brain as well. And what I've also found is being creative, more creative in this season has really, really helped me. So for the last 20 or 30 years, I go to a particular part of England, which is a lake district, lots of rolling hills, and I tend to go there alone for 3 days. Everybody's used to it now. All my girlfriends used to say, you should have told me, I would have come with you. But the purpose was to go on my own, to clear my head. And I have found I have my freshest thinking. So instead of moving from once a year, I try to do that more often, not going to the Lake District, but getting out into nature. So I'm part of a walking group. So I go walking, and when I come back, it seems to me I get a download of ideas. And as soon as I get home, I've just got to write it all down. I get the freshest thinking and ideas, and I've just got to write it all down. So it's operating from a different part of the brain, which is a fabulous thing. So those are practical tips for me. If you're not near anywhere in nature, get into the garden. Can't get into the garden, walk around the block, but it's just focusing on something away from a laptop and away from the books, raising our eyes up, looking at the sky or whatever, and rejoicing in that. I think what I have been guilty of in the past is forgetting to be grateful for some things and just being grateful for the food I have in my cup, just all those things, but also going out into nature and just looking at the beauty of things that are just there. And again, it just shifts the focus. And I have the best sleep ever. So strangely enough, every time I spend more than 2 or 3 hours in nature, I get the best sleep ever.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. I was working with a client a little while ago, going back to the body hears it. And the activity I gave her was, I want you to look at yourself in the mirror every day and just look at yourself in the eyes and say, I love you.
Yeah.
I love you. And she was so uncomfortable with it. And I said, I know, because we have not loved ourselves. And it takes time, but knowing that the body hears it is really important in that practice. That yes, you might be uncomfortable in the moment, but your body is hearing and feeling that vibration of love. And so the more you do that and allow yourself to let your body hear and feel, it will actually start to transform the way you feel about yourself to the point where you do love yourself.
Yeah.
And yeah, and that's so key. And again, the nature part is so important, and actually being present. I love the way you were speaking about looking up and really noticing. I actually was listening to, I can't remember the person, the CBC, which is a Canadian Broadcasting Company. And she was talking about, she was a professor and was doing research about what happens when you are actually present. So the thing that can happen is, we have the checklist of things, right? Especially in perimenopause and menopause, we now have this checklist of things that we have to do to keep ourselves healthy and well. And if we're just moving through the checklist, like we're just moving through a list. So, okay, well, on my list today is I have to get outside for a walk. So I get out and I go for my walk, but I'm not present in it. It is not that it's not effective at all, but it will be less effective than when you do stop and notice. Like for me today, as I look outside, it is just a blanket of snow, and we have sunshine for the first time in many days. So noticing that, like the way the sun sparkles on the snow and the freshness of that and the blue sky, noticing those things makes a huge difference in how my body responds than just like going out on my mission driven, I'm doing my walk today.
Sure. And again, one of the things, I'm quite intentional in my preparation when I go for a walk. I take a flask of my best coffee. So with my rucksack and a flask, and there's a particular bench in this area, and I always sit and have a flask so I am centered and just looking at the ducks and the swans. And sometimes a robin will come and sit with me, and I'll have a coffee and just really focus. So enjoying the coffee, being mindful presence with the coffee, and just enjoying where I am now. And I've found that really helps. I think the flask of coffee helps because it focuses me that I'm going to sit down and enjoy this coffee than just off walking, getting 11,000 steps, come back. I've done the steps and I've got an hour to spare. I'll do something else. But no, actually, sitting down and resting and doing that is great. And sometimes, actually, I might put some music on my phone and just dance. Just get up and just down and just move and dance. It's a different form of exercise. Obviously, it's 8 o'clock in the morning when I'm doing this, but I'll get up and I'll just have a little bit of a dance. Then I'll drink my coffee and just survey the beauty of the trees and just the noises as well. The birds, just really listening in and all that. And I get the best download ever.
And in the time that we are in, it is going to be more important than ever that we really hold ourselves accountable to ourselves for doing these practices. Because going back to what you were saying earlier about listening in the car about some male leaders fretting the lack of patriarchy and seeing this shift to feminine leadership. And I am in North America. And so it is in mid-January. And so it is inescapable.
Yes.
Of what is happening in our world. I also was listening to a very similar interview where some of the richest men and leaders, I'm going to use leaders in air quotes. Yes, they have leadership positions, but are in this swing of actually saying, like, we need to get back to male culture. We need to, and are eliminating DEI programs in the biggest organizations on the globe.
Yeah.
And for you and I, who are doing work in the menopause space in the workplace, that is deeply feminine.
Yeah.
It is really important. And how are you thinking about how you're going to continue to walk forward in this resistance, right? And we know, like, when we look at the patterns of history, this is what happens. When change happens, there is resistance. And it pushes back, and then change marches forward again. But right now we're in the resistance and the pushing back. So how do you see yourself continuing to walk forward against the resistance during this really intense time?
Yeah, well, first of all, I recognise one of the frameworks. I think it's one of the organisational development frameworks where most groups we go through the forming, storming, and norming. So I recognise where we are now. And yes, it is a terrible thing. But before we can get to normalisation, we've got to go through, some of the structures crumbling and all the rest of those things. And I also remember as a child from the 60s, what happened there through the storming, then the normalisation. So there's been a number of things. And when we think about industrialisation and all the different mechanisms and things that have taken place, they have all gone through that. So I recognise that. Where am I in all that right now? There has never been a stronger time to really get grounded and get clear for everybody and to have a practice. It's so important to have a practice. I was listening to, I'm a big fan of Wayne Dyer. Your Thoughts, Change Your Mind. I think I've got his book, but I was listening to him on YouTube. And there's never been a time to get grounded with ourselves and get clear while all is around us. Get clear on what is it we want to achieve? What do we want to do? How can I serve? How can I serve? And it doesn't have to be, a lead with billions as you've just referred to. We can serve in different ways. Just smiling at somebody, that reverberates. For me, giving somebody a smile, I can't walk in everybody's shoes. We don't know what journeys they are in or have been in, but just that smile is a ripple in life. So there's something around me getting clear and also around compassion. That's the thing for me, having compassion. Interestingly, Wayne Dyer, obviously no longer with us, but he was talking about some of the global wars and how people are cheering that certain wars are over. But he said, I don't know if it's Dalai Lama or somebody he spoke to, about we should be sad when people lives have lost, even though war has been what we should still grieve sadness. So there's something about, yes, getting clear on self and also having compassion for others, having some sense of compassion for others, but having practice, a daily practice, but being intentional about it. So as you said, Lisa, not just walking around the block and me saying, 11,000 steps or whatever, but being very clear and intentional on a daily practice. And looking at the mirror is one thing, could be one thing, and letting your body hear it, you hearing it, looking yourself in the eyes as well, and telling yourself you are worthy. You are worthy of boundaries. You are worthy of sleep. You are worthy of all these things, and having that positive mindset. And it's a struggle. Sometimes I fall off the wagon. I've got to get on it. That's how it is. But I've got to continually, think, oh, I've not done that. I need to do that and get back on it. There's never been an important time because of where we are globally.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you are bang on when you're talking about compassion. I think sometimes the storming comes from movements where, there's the famous quotation, when you are used to holding privilege, equality feels like oppression, right? So that is what we are seeing. We're seeing all of these people who have held power and suddenly they feel like they are being oppressed. That's not the reality structurally, but their human experience is their human experience.
Yes.
And shifting a little bit so that we have compassion for each other. Because often we go into these situations feeling all of our own pain and lived reality and lived experience. And when we are in that place, we don't always make space for someone else's pain and lived reality and experience. And so my wondering is if we are able to shift the way we approach these conversations so that it is indeed conversation, instead of like a direct, this is what you've been doing, that's been wrong, this is how it's hurt me, and this is how you're going to do it now. But moving into like in conversations that I actually have had with most men about menopause, is they just are curious and they don't know. And the structures have been set up that it's not okay for them to ask questions or to wonder. And so they're left with all of this curiosity, but have no idea and are in these societal structures where they just feel like they have to know everything. And so they pretend like they do. And that is where things really start to fall apart, because they're pretending to know, actually having no idea, but being really curious about what the truth actually is and what our reality actually is. So when I have sat down in conversation with men and just said, ask me your questions, here's some initial information, what are the things you wonder about? It really changes the way that conversation happens. And I'm wondering if you've had any similar experiences.
Yeah, and it really reminds me in terms of my DEI work as well, that can often be the approach where people are afraid to show their vulnerability as senior leaders. I should know this, but I don't, so I'm not going to say anything. But the danger is that can cause harm to others. So there's something about feeling psychologically safe. How can we set up being psychologically safe? But also the other side is, it is not the work, or it's not always the work of going back to raise the Black woman. So often the Black woman can be the mammy looking after everybody and forgetting. The work is out there, the research is out there, it's about doing the work. And I think perhaps could be a shift in terms of allyship or reverse mentoring. But the work has to come, the heavy lifting has to come from those who are particularly interested, who should know. In terms of our male colleagues, I really like the way you use that word, because I use the word a lot, curious. So opening up my conversation, I tend to say, I'm curious, what are your thoughts on? so that our male colleagues don't feel it's a direct attack and it's an exam question that they need to answer, but opening up with curiosity. What are your thoughts? I'm curious. And opening up like that is so much better to have that initial conversation and then to come back, holding that space. And actually, there could be a space for male to have that conversation if it's managed correctly. But getting curious and opening up that conversation in that sense means that the male ego is not going to feel threatened.
Yes, exactly. I think I've told this story before, but I was at a networking event around this time last year, actually. And I had been talking to the organizer, and she said, "Oh, I need to go finish setting up this thing up. Here, talk to this person." And she introduced me, and it was this young man, is sort of mid-20s, tall, blonde, like all of the privilege you could possibly imagine. And he was working in insurance, and he said, so he's telling me about what he does. And he said, "So what do you do?" And I said, "I am a menopause coach and consultant." And I could see like he initially just was trying to get out of the conversation. He's like, "There's a health and wellness person around here somewhere." And I was like, "Mm-hmm." And then I will give him this. He stopped for a minute and he said, "Well, like, what do you actually do?" And so I started talking about menopause and the way it shows itself and what we can do to actually feel better, that this doesn't just have to be our reality, and how, like working out my way through all of that. And as I'm talking, I'm watching his face change. And so in my mind, I'm like, what is happening? Like his face is really changing. What's happening? And I stopped, and he said, "I really wish I had known this when I was a teenager, because I was on my own hormonal ride, and in listening to you, I am now understanding what my mom was experiencing."
Yeah.
And her experience and my experience intersected in a really hard way. And if I had known this, our relationship might be different.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I tell that story a lot because it is a really powerful example of what happens when we give ourselves a moment to be curious and actually ask a question, listen, and then allow ourselves to start making connections, right? Because a lot of people think, "Oh, this is just information that's for women who are between the ages of 35 and 60. And it's really not, right? Our relationship, that mother-child relationship is, I hadn't really even thought about it, despite the fact that it was happening in my own life, right? Like well, my oldest is now 20, but I had teenage boys who we were able to have that conversation after I listened to him talk about that relationship with his mother. So with best intentions, compassion, and curiosity, opening up these conversations that welcome each other in rather than create spaces of blame and shame, I think can really shift the way it is for our experience as facilitators and leaders and people who are doing the learning.
Yeah, sure. And there's something about us as leaders showing our authenticity and vulnerability. So by showing our vulnerability, we can open up our sharing the story. Thank you for sharing your personal story, Lisa. There's something about sharing, and then there's power in storytelling sometimes. Often in our line of work as a coach, as a licensed menopause champion, we're driven by data. And actually, there's something about the qualitative data, the power of the story, getting underneath the story, the nuances, the complexities of that. So often I hear menopause champions talking about the statistics of A, B, C, and D. What's the story behind that? What are the nuances? What are the practical tips? So I think there's power in that, in sharing our stories and sharing the vulnerability. And I think that's got to go hand in hand with anybody who's a menopause coach. It's got to go hand in hand. If we've had that story, what's our own story? I know working in a hospital, the menopause hit me and I wasn't expecting it. And I was quite late, actually, in my early 50s. And then suddenly I was walking in the clinical area and I was absolutely flooding. And I didn't know what on earth, just flooding. And then the next minute, 2 or 3 days, I wasn't. Stop, start, stop, start. I had to take fresh underwear to work because I didn't know what was happening. I was always feeling cold. I remember going to a Chinese practitioner and she looked at my eyes and my tongue and she was asking what I was eating. And every day I was having salads and yogurt. She said, the food is too cold. Yin, yang, you need hot food, hot food. I was always so cold in the office. It was a standing joke. So all those little nuances, and they're so different for everybody. So different. So that was my experience. And then the vulnerability. Who could I speak to about this? Everybody around me was slightly younger. They probably had a different experience. There was nobody of colour I could share that with also. I am the professional in this clinical area, so I daren't mention what on earth I'm going through. So all those things, you can have a lack of confidence, but sharing those stories, I think, are so powerful, along with the data that we have.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's one of the things I worry about in the menopause world is that we get so wrapped up in the symptoms, the symptomology and the data, it's important. There's nothing about me that's saying it's not important. It is, but it's one part of a woman's much larger story. And when we only focus on this one slice, we miss out on everything that makes that woman who she actually is and what her experience is. And so absolutely getting to the story and the whole breadth of the context of that woman's life is essential to how she can make herself feel better, how she connects to community, what's the information that she actually needs, and even just the power that exists in telling your own story.
You're absolutely right. I was invited to work with a group of Black and Brown NHS women professionals to lead on imposter syndrome. It's a conference I ran 2 workshops back to back, and it was full. The workshop was full around the imposter syndrome, and I did open up by telling my story. However, once I further researched imposter syndrome and its origins was developed by a white woman whose research focused on middle-class white women. So we were missing from that. And I've heard lots of discussions online around Black women don't suffer from the imposter syndrome. They are systems of oppression which create that. But my view is that if a woman believes she's suffering from the imposter syndrome, who am I to say, no, you're not? A woman of colour, white woman, whoever, who am I to say that? So the request at the workshop was for that, and people recognise that, and we had discussions and we worked through that with practical tips. But I also recognise the research and how that was brought about and how Black women were considered and those challenges that are faced. So I think there's always something, again, about being wary of our data sources and those nuances and considering those. It's complex, so complex, isn't it, Lisa?
Yes, it is complex because that's humanity. We are billions of humans with different physical makeups, different lived realities, different experiences, all converging on this experiment that is this life that we're living in.
Yeah.
And that I really like the way you phrased that. I think that's a really powerful way of looking at data, asking questions, and realizing that no group is a monolith. There are patterns, and there are some things that we can, and the data that we can look at for sure, but also making sure that we make room for each person's individual experience.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. So I tend to use the framework when we talk about DEI, the framework from Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, who talks about intersectionality, and that offers up the nuances. So when I see the data, I want to know the nuances. How have we determined from that? Who did we speak to about that? Who's missing in that stakeholder group or whoever? Who is not there? Whose voice isn't in that space? Who needs to be heard? Because yes, we're not a monolith, even though we've been sectioned into black, white. And, let's not forget that black is socially constructed. It's a social construct. So, black is just something that I've been told that I am black, and it's a social construct. So whichever way I cut and slice it, or we are political as women who are menopause coaches, certainly me as a as a Black woman and us as cisgendered women. We are political. Whatever we say from emanates from our mouth, it's going to be political.
Yes, it is. It is unavoidable.
It is. But we are here, or I am here, to serve others, share my experiences, my insights in a book. I'm almost completing my first book on, the title is Burning My Superwoman Cape, Leadership Life Lessons After the Cape Has Gone. So I'm almost completed that book. And it talks from my cultural heritage, my journey, my different roles in different jobs, how I have felt, how I've managed to remain resilient, some of the challenges, some of the successes. But that book is for 14 or 15-year-old girl who hasn't got a career, who may not be able to afford to go to university, and also for somebody who's coming towards the end of their career and they're in the season that I am in, and also for the coach who is coaching somebody who may be going through the menopause and through this season in life. So it's a real mixed bag, but it's sort of a semi-autobiography, but at each chapter it has lessons learned, my leadership lessons learned, and a summary. So, that sort of links with all these things. And again, part of this season has said, right, Beverley, this is the time. Be ready. I would never have done it before, but the season is right.
Yes. Well, I hope that you come back when your book is published.
I'd love to.
Yeah, that would be really, I would love to have a conversation about your book. So we will look forward to having that conversation. And just as we wrap up here, thank you so much for sharing all your wisdom and knowledge with us here today. And I think leaving our community with Kimberly Crenshaw and intersectionality, if you take something away from this today, look up intersectionality if you haven't heard of it before, because it helps frame both yourself and the people, all of the people around you. When you start looking at every person that you see as an intersectional human and not just the surface of whatever it is that you think you see, it changes the way you interact with every person in the world. So Thank you.
It's been fantastic. I've really enjoyed it. How wonderful. What an experience to connect with you, Lisa. The stars were aligned.
The stars were aligned, and I'm so glad we had this conversation, and I look forward to our next one.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining me on this week's episode of Transforming 45. I hope you feel inspired, empowered, and ready to embrace every facet of your midlife journey. If you enjoyed our conversation, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review. These actions make a world of difference in growing our podcast community. Your support helps us reach much more amazing listeners just like you. And don't forget, please share an episode you love with a friend or with your community. Sharing our stories is what helps our community grow. Keep shining your midlife magic, and I'll catch you next week.